Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the Acumatica consumption model. I'm Michaela Terenzio, Customer Marketing Manager here at Acumatica, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And hosting today's presentation, we have myself and Ali Johnny, our Chief Product Officer here at Acumatica. And before we jump into the deck and I turn things over to Ali, a couple of housekeeping slides mentions for you. First, if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please go ahead and use the Q&A box in the RingCentral recording, and we will be able to get those questions answered for you as soon as possible. And then lastly, this webinar is going to be recorded and we'll make it available for you on the customer portal and via email after this call. And now I am delighted to turn it over to Ali. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Michaela, and hello, everybody. So we put this session together because we get a lot of requests about and questions around our licensing. So what I thought would be very useful for us to do today is kind of a little bit go over about the licensing options that Acumatica has, a little bit about what the SaaS offering is and why it's important. And then a lot of our focus would be around the consumption-based licensing, so we can learn about ins and outs of what that consumption-based model looks like, because over the years, Acumatica has changed a little bit on how we measure consumption, and we want to talk through that. But most importantly, I think this session is really for the audience, and I wanted to make sure that we get as many questions answered as possible. So please don't feel shy about putting questions in. Chances are, if you have a question, somebody else has something similar. So bring those in. I will try to catch them either during the session as I see the questions that are applicable. But if not, I don't get it during the session, I will get it at the end of the session as we move on. So let's get started. So a little bit about myself. I am the Chief Product Officer here at Acumatica. I run the product management team. I manage the product direction of the company. And as well as I do design, my team is responsible for the Acumatica pricing. So we obviously look at what the market is and how we can make our licensing easier and easier. ERP as a whole has complex licensings. We've tried to take some of the complexity out, but by far, we are not the simplest licensing model, but at the same time, I think when you compare us to what the market has, Acumatica's licensing model is fairly straightforward. A little bit about the different deployment options. When you license Acumatica, there are primarily two different ways you can deploy Acumatica, and you have to initially decide that up front, but you can certainly change deployment options after the fact. So once you start with something, don't feel like you're going to get stuck. So we have our public cloud option, which is what we call the Acumatica SaaS offering, which we'll talk a lot about today. And then there's a private cloud option, which has its own benefits and challenges, and we'll talk through those as well. And then the private cloud options have either a subscription-based model where you can annually license the model, or you can get what we call a perpetual license on the private cloud version, where you buy the license essentially in a perpetual manner, and then you pay an annual maintenance fee. By far, 98% of our customers go with a subscription model, and most of the large majority of customers today go with our SaaS offering. And I'll talk a little bit about why the SaaS offering is superior in most customer views. So a little bit about Acumatica SaaS. Today we do use AWS for our infrastructure. We run on many geo zones of AWS. So we typically look at where the customer headquarters is and their operations are, and we deploy your Acumatica instance in one of the zones that's most closest to you that we operate in. We operate in two zones in the US, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And then we have several zones in Canada and UK and Singapore and throughout the world to try to be as close as possible. to the clients. In reality, the performance is similar no matter where we deploy, but sometimes people want the data to be as close to them as possible, and that helps us with our maintenance windows that we run. Once in a while we have to do updates and upgrades and take care of security stuff. So running in a zone that's closest to you helps us make sure those maintenance windows run overnight when you're not using the system. The benefits of SaaS are generally, you don't have to worry about the hardware, the server, the software that you have to install for the operating system. It gets you started really, really quickly and gets the most value out of your system as quickly as possible, whether it's through the upgrade process of installing updates, um, not having to deal with servers and patches and those types of things significantly help. But most importantly, I think security and availability are the top reasons people choose SaaS. We do have a 99.9999% uptime uh, over our history, very close to 100%. And that includes our maintenance time window. Most vendors don't include that. Then, of course, security is a big area that I'll touch on real quick. But all this in general helps you focus on your business, so you don't have to rely on IT staff to manage your environment. A little bit about security. If you choose to go with Acumatica SaaS infrastructure, we are SOC 1 compliant, both Type 1 and Type 2. These are basically security standards and service operation compliance standards that are used by publicly traded companies. So chances are, if you go with our SaaS environment, we're going to be at much, much higher secured standards than typically customers can deploy on their own. We are audited by top tier providers regularly. So we use Moss Adams as our security audit firm, and they do the SOC 1 compliance. And the SOC 1 compliance reports are available to our customers. They just need to sign an NDA, and we can get them a copy of the SOC 1 reports, and they're refreshed regularly. The other benefits of obviously getting on the cloud is we take away things like you don't have to worry about storing credit card information. We make sure that everything in our environment is PCI ready. We protect against ransomware. That's one of the large reasons we see a lot of our customers were hit by ransomware in their prior solution that they were before they came to Acumatica. And one of the primary reasons when they choose Acumatica SaaS is they want to get away from managing the security that goes around ransomware. Of course, infrastructure security. I mean, imagine the security that Amazon has as their data centers. And then we have a lot of extra layers on top of that for intrusion detection. This is both on a firewall level and an application level. There's application level intrusion detection built into Acumatica, and it can even protect against things like DDoS attacks and other types of attacks that are common. The other benefit of SaaS, as we mentioned, is high availability. And what we do on this is we put you in a primary location, as I talked about. If you're on the West Coast, you'd be at the West Coast Geo Center. But we replicate your data regularly to the alternate geozone. So your data is always available on the West Coast and the East Coast, for example. If you're in overseas, we replicate to 2 locations as well. So your data is always in 2 locations, and in an event of a disaster, within our SLA terms, we can bring your operations back online. And the maximum amount of data that you will lose is 15 minutes because we replicate that data in the background every 15 minutes, and it's available across our geozones. So that's another benefit. And then probably another thing to think about is just because you take data and let's say you decide to go with a private cloud, and there's lots of good private cloud hosting options, but when you simply put your data on Amazon, it doesn't mean that you get all the benefits. So you still have to worry about the compliance. You have to worry about your own backup plan for backing up your data, your application uptime, because a lot of providers will just give you IT uptime. They'll make sure your server's up, but they're not going to give you an SLA on Acumatica application working at all times. So these types of things are included. We back up your data. There's always 45 copies of your data in backup form. So we can always go back to 3 days before or a week before or a month before and restore these types of backups. And we also do test backups. So it's not just about backing them up. It's also making sure those backups are intact and they are restorable. And those are the types of uh, extra precautions we take with our SaaS environments. So just keep that in mind. A little bit about licensing. So you choose up front if you want SaaS or if you want private cloud, but all of these are covered by our licensing agreements and our licensing guide. A licensing guide is very helpful to you. A lot of the material we're going to be talking about today are going to be in the licensing guide, so you can go back and reference them. I would highly encourage for you guys to read that. And if there are questions, obviously you can always come to us with those. But the license guide is available at Acumatica.com agreements, and you can learn more about the ins and outs of our licensing. Okay, so a little bit about our licensing options. Let's assume you picked Acumatica SaaS or private. Either way, you have two options when you purchase a license. One is consumption-based, which we're going to focus on this session, which is or user-based, right? So user-based was a traditional way of doing ERP licensing. We've, for the most part, have phased that out. We do have exceptions for our small business editions. So we have a product we call the small business edition that comes with 5 users and it can go to a maximum of 10 users. But majority, large majority of our customers, I would say over 90% of our clients are on our what we call our advanced and enterprise editions, and all of those are typically consumption-based licensing with a few exceptions. And what is consumption-based licensing? Acumatica has 2 models of consumption-based licensing, and this is where some change occurred back in April of 2018. Prior to April 2018, customers who purchased before that, our main consumption measurement was number of resources, CPU cores that were allotted for our customers. So when you purchase a license, you would buy something like a small, medium, or large license, and they would map to number of CPU cores that were allotted to you for consumption. So if you bought a small license, for example, it would be a 2-core license. If you bought a medium, it would be 4-core. And if you bought large, it would be 8-core, and so on. Okay? And those are for customers pre-2018. What we did in April of 2018 is we moved away from core licensing, and we went to something we call transaction consumption tiers. And what that does for our customers is it eliminates bottlenecks at the hardware level. So we wanted to make sure that customers get the maximum performance that their hardware allows and the maximum performance capacity that we may have available in our infrastructure to allocate to them so that they can get the best experience. So instead of putting throttles on amount of hardware you use, we simply measure consumption of transactions. And what that allows us to do is to stay true to our unlimited user, so that you can pay only for a number of, for as you grow, so that as you do more and more transactions over time, hopefully that means you're doing more business and you're doing better. It allows you to improve everyone, and it doesn't mean that you need to worry about, oh, I added a employee, so I need to add a license for them. You can include your contractors, your vendors in the process. You can include your other stakeholders. So you want to give access to as many people as possible, so unlimited users, but at the same time, allows us to grow with you as you conduct more and more business. So the way we measure transaction tiers, instead of looking at number of cores, we look at these tiers of transactions. So for example, if you look at this chart, M1, M2, M3 are what we call our medium tiers, and it allows you to do up to 3,000 what we call commercial transactions a month, and then M2 would be 4,000, M3 would be 5,000, and so on. And the common question we get is, well, what is a commercial transaction? And a commercial transaction is typically when you interact with either a vendor or a customer. So we take the single highest type of transaction that you do. And for example, most B2C and B2B customers are going to work and with their clients, and they're going to use most likely our invoicing module, our sales orders, our shipping modules, and they're going to create a bunch of orders, and they're going to ship those orders, and they're going to collect money on those orders. So typically for them, it's number of sales orders per month. So you don't need to overthink it. Simply think, what is the most common type of transaction that you do? And typically they're going to be either sales orders or payments or AP documents or invoices, and you pick the one that you do the most, and that's the only one we count. You don't accumulate across all of them. We try to simplify the model that we focus on the one that is the highest, and that's simply that one that maps to monthly commercial transactions. Then we have this other thing we call monthly ERP transactions. And this is simply when you think about when you're on a screen and you press the save button, the system has to go back and save that transaction or the changes that you've made. And those numbers are much, much higher scale. Typically, these don't come into play for 99% of our customers. If you're in a standard order of business, the number of ERP transactions you have is plenty to cover you for the number of commercial transactions that you're performing. When this comes into play is if you have something extraordinary that you do that takes a lot of high volume. So for example, you may have integrations to an external system with CRM, and you're creating enormous number of activities in this system. Or you're doing some manufacturing process outside of the systems, and you're bringing EDI transactions in for production orders or something like that. So just consult with your partner on that, but generally the ERP transactions are more than sufficient to cover your transactions. The other area that we see this ERP transactions come in is we have clients that do a lot of GL transactions, and they push GL transactions in from an outside source. Well, GL transactions don't affect a vendor or a customer, so they don't count as a commercial transaction, but they count as an ERP transaction. So if you're just using GL only and you're pushing data back and forth from an outside system, those would be a transaction. Now, one thing to think about here is we don't worry about number of lines. Number of lines does not change number of commercial transactions. So if you have a one invoice with 100 lines, it still counts as one commercial transactions. So you don't have to worry about number of lines in the document. We only care about number of invoice numbers that you have, number of purchase order numbers that you have, number of checks that you wrote, check numbers, those type of things. And again, we take the single highest one. So hopefully that'll make it a little bit clear. Okay, so where do you see this information, and how do you know which licensing system that you have? So when you purchase a license from us, you have the licensing key that your partner provides you. You do have access to that key information on our customer portal. If you have not logged into the portal, that's an area that you want to go in and check out. It's portal.acumatica.com. And then under your account information, you can access that license key. But better yet, you can access the license information right from your instance. So if you go to Acumatica and in the search bar type in license, you'll see a bunch of menu options. One of them is going to be activate license. In the activate license menu, you're going to see, okay, this is the status of your license. In this case, it's a valid license. I happen to be on a user-based and a core-based license here, and it shows you all the features that are enabled for you, okay, for that license. So as you add new modules and you subscribe to functionality, new things will show up in this area. And then you have another area in the software that you can activate and disable functionality you don't need. But the license also controls what features show up. More importantly, if you search on that license keyword, you'll see another screen called License Monitoring Console. In the Licensing Monitoring Console, you'll be able to see your historical volumes. So the same consumption that we talked about, number of commercial transactions, number of ERP transactions, and how close are you getting to the limits will be shown. So the data is shown on a monthly basis, And then you can also, when you highlight a particular month, in this case, I've highlighted February, it can show me daily information on what am I doing that's driving up my transaction volume. And if you press this commercial transaction details, you can even see what kind of transaction they are. Are they sales invoices? Are they purchase orders? What kind of transactions are they? You can see that information here as well. So if you haven't seen this before, make sure you go check out the licensing console, and I'll give you a little bit of information. Let me switch screens because I think seeing it in real life will give you a little bit more detail. So I'm going to make sure I am logged in here real quick. I'm going to log in. Okay. So as I said, you just type in a few letters like this, licensing, and you'll see the options come up. I went to the license monitoring console, and it's showing me on the statistics tab, here's my statistics. And then on the license tab, in this example, I am a license level tier 2. It means up to 10,000 commercial transactions a month, this many ERP transactions, how much storage is included. 999 means generally infinite, but if you're on our SaaS environment, this number might be a little bit lower. And then there's something we call recommended maximums and constraints that I'll come back to in a minute. And then you have your statistics tab, which shows you the data. And then it also shows you a percentage number, how close you're getting to your thresholds. So this is an area that you want to watch. And generally, we're very good about this. So just because you license the lower tier, don't worry that, oh my gosh, I'm going to get to my maximum and the system is going to crash or it's not going to let me do more. We don't do that. We let you go over your limits. Some warnings will register in the warnings tab, but the system will continue to operate. And we generally reach out to your partner and say, hey, this customer looks like they're getting close to their limits, or they've just surpassed their limits. Can you please have a discussion with your client? So they get with you, they talk about it. Maybe it was an anomaly. Maybe it only happens once or twice a year. We allow you to go over the limits 3 months a year. So with each license cycle that you're on, annual subscription that you're on, you can go over your limits 3 times a year. And then if you go beyond that during your next renewal, I mean, obviously we ask you to upgrade, but certainly by your next renewal, you need to take care of that with your partner so you can get an appropriate level. If you have a very seasonal business, and always you have 4 months out of the year that you have high consumption, it's best that you talk to your partner about that. And sometimes we can do seasonal bursts. We do have some licensings available where we can make sure we give you enough resources for those 4 months so that you can operate very well in your busy seasons. If you don't tell us, the system will let you still operate, but you might get suboptimal performance. Once you get to your limits, the system may slow down just a little bit, or you'll notice that the amount of resources that are allotted to you are not sufficient to handle that kind of a volume. Many times it'll work fine for you. It just depends on what kind of transactions you do. But if you see some sluggishness in the performance and you're doing high volume, you kind of get the idea of what that is, and then talk to your partner. They can generally create a case, or if you have a support plan with us, you can create a case and we can look into what's driving the performance behavior, and is it licensing or is it something else, and we can work with you to figure that out. Okay. All right, back to this constraints. So there's also something in the system called constraints, and the history will show you any violations of constraints, but it comes back to this licensing area, and there's an area called constraints, and then there's an area called recommended maximums. Okay, so the constraints are there to protect your environment. So the most common ones that we get a lot of questions on are things like number of inventory items. In this case, this license is set up to be maximum of 200,000 inventory items. So the number of inventory items, business accounts, fixed assets, we can increase these 3. These are recommended constraints. But if you are dealing with a lot more, as long as you let us know and we have a discussion with you, we can increase the number of inventory items business accounts. And the reason we want to have a discussion is to make sure that we understand how are you going to be using that system. As an example, if you have business accounts that are 1 million business accounts, but only a few thousand of them have balances, chances are you're going to be perfectly fine. But if you have 100,000 of them and you try to create a customer statements in the system, imagine producing a report with 100,000 pages and how long it would take the system to go create a statements for 100,000 customers with balances, or printing an AR report with 100,000 customers having a balance. So we just want to have a discussion to make sure you understand the repercussions of having so many accounts with balances. Same thing with inventory. If you're printing an inventory report with millions of products, it could end up being hundreds or thousands of pages long. We want to make sure that we educate you a little bit on that, and then we would increase these constraints for you after that. So that's just a quick discussion. There's a couple other ones here. Number of lines per document. This is lines per transaction. These are typically hard limits. We can increase them slightly, but we cannot increase them indefinitely. This has a significant performance hit on your system. So if you're creating a purchase order with 5,000 lines, every time you interact with that purchase order or save the purchase order, it can impact other people on that environment. So these are the maximums that we've set to protect the system. So same thing with serial numbers per document. These two are fairly hard constraints. We do have some leeway per request, but we can't double and triple the numbers. We may be able to increase them slightly, but there's other ways to work around that. So just talk to us about that. And then if you're on consumption-based licensing, these have to do with number of API requests that come into the system and number of integrations that you have. But typically, these numbers are always well enough to handle any kind of situation. If you do very, very high volume, like we're talking about thousands of orders a day coming in from external systems, let's have a discussion on that so that we make sure that your API environment is set up correctly to be able to handle that load. Okay, I do see a bunch of questions coming in, but most of them I would like to take at the end of the call, so keep those questions coming. I appreciate that. Okay, back to these slides. Okay, next topic I want to talk about. We just talked about these recommendations and constraints. The licensing guide is a good area that talks about these a little bit in more detail. This is an example of the page in the licensing guide. It is a PDF file that you can download. So go learn more about these recommended constraints and system recommendations, and if there's any questions, we can talk about those. Okay, the other topic we get a lot of questions about is, how many entities or how many companies can I handle with my license? Am I allowed to create as many companies as I want, and so on? But there's this definition that I want to go through so that we all understand what is a company, what is a branch, what is a tenant, and what is an instance, right? So these are the types of questions that we get all the time. So with each license that you buy, your primary users who log into the system and get it and log into the UI, we call that an application instance, okay? When you purchase a license, your license gives you a instance of Acumatica, and then you may also have a separate license for portals if you license portals from us. If you got a sandbox from us, we might give you a license for a sandbox, and that's specific for a sandbox. There's something called processing nodes, which have licenses that I'll touch on in a little bit. And then if you're doing high availability deployments, you might have multiple instances. So just remember that it's one license per instance, right? So that's where your license is tied to, okay? And then within this instance, you basically have one database, right, which holds all your information. And within that database, you may have one or more tenants. Okay, so when you buy the software, um, Small Business Edition is limited to a single tenant. Okay, Advanced Edition comes with 5 tenants, but you can add as many tenants as you like at extra price. Okay, and Enterprise Edition comes with even more. What a tenant is completely separated um, data. There's no data being shared between tenants. You can run some consolidation reporting across tenants, so you can consolidate your financials, but there's really no transactions happening between tenants, and there's no data being shared between tenants other than consolidation reporting. So that's the only level of sharing that you can do is on consolidation reporting. But all transactional data is independent. So your users are independent here, your employees are independent in another tenant. So a lot of our customers create another tenant for just playing around in a training company, for example. You can create a training tenant, and that will be completely separate from your regular tenant. Now, what they do have in common is they are stored in a single physical database, which means that they all have to be on the same version. You cannot have one version on one tenant and another version on another tenant. So that's where you need a sandbox. If you want to do, for example, you want to see your data in version 2020 and you're on 2019, this is where we deploy a sandbox and we give you a different instance for that sandbox so that you can be on a different version to test and play with. But if you're in the same version, you can simply add another tenant, copy the data from one tenant to another using our snapshot technology, and then you could play in a non-production tenant per se. So that's what a tenant is. Okay. Okay, then within each tenant, you can have as many companies as you want. You can create companies, and there's no limit on companies. We don't price per company. Um, and then within a company, you can have as many branches as you want. Okay, so typically this layer of sharing information on a company and branch level is basically you're sharing your customers, vendors, CRM data, employees, inventory data. Everything is shared at this level. If you want to separate those types of things, you have to create a separate tenant. What you're sharing at this level is only your financials. So your financials, things like customers, uh, you can have different tenants have visibility to different customers. My company A only has these customers. My company B has visibility to a different set of customers. So you can control visibility of customers and then your financial statements. When you create your chart of accounts, you can say these chart of accounts are for this company 1, these other chart of accounts are for company 2. They still share chart of accounts, but transactional wise, for financial statements generation wise, you can create separate financials across these, but you can share uh, customers, vendors, inventory, that kind of data. And the system can interact, create intercompany transactions between companies and branches. Okay, so that's a high level view of what licensing is on an instance level, and then how it rolls out to companies and branches. Okay, so how does this thing get deployed? When you, let's say you want to put this in your own environment, right? Obviously, if you go with Acumatica SaaS, we handle this all for you. But in reality, there's always a server involved, right? There's some server, that server is running a database, and then there is a website, which is your URL, and that's what we call the Acumatica application instance. So these two can run on one server, or they can run on multi-servers. In this example, this is a single server deployment. You have both your database and your web server on the same physical hardware. This could be a virtual machine too. It doesn't have to be physical. It could be virtual machine, and a virtual machine could have both a website and a SQL server on it, uh, serving your customer, right? So that's a single server configuration. Most commonly, This is how most customers are deployed. They come through an internet, then there's an application server, which is your website, whether it's physical or virtual, it doesn't matter. This is what we call your application instance. Uh, this is where your URL is, your website. And then for performance management purposes and security purposes, you can take the database and put it on a physically different server or a virtual environment, and you're segregating these two, and they're in different zones, so there's a firewall between these two, and that protects your database from the web, and there's only specific data elements made available to Acumatica only as the application server. So this spreads the load on multiple pieces of hardware and allows your application to run here, and your database runs on a separate server. Okay, so this is the most common one. Then there is high capacity type of environments where you're doing a very large volume, and you want to make sure you have also high availability in case there's failure of systems. How does a system keep performing? The typical example is what we call a load balance configuration. In this configuration, some of our large customers, there's always a load balancer. So the traffic comes from the internet, hits a load balancer, whether it's a software or hardware. That's up to the customer what they use if they're in their environment. If they're in our environment, obviously there's a hardware load balancer. And then the system looks at which server is less busy, and it directs traffic based on some criteria, whether it's busyness, whether it's round robin. There's many different methodologies how the traffic is routed, but you have the base principle here is you have two instances of application working for you, so you get twice as much performance, almost twice as much. There is some overhead because of this load balancer, and then you have a common database. You still, are logged into your normal company, but this is kind of abstracted. You don't notice this exists in the background, but that's there, and it helps you with both performance, high availability, which means if one of these servers dies, so let's assume this server crashes, your users are continuing to work through one of the other servers. So in this example, we're just showing 2 servers, but in real life, this may be 5 servers, 10 servers, 20 servers. It can scale a number of servers here. Okay. Now, what's important is if you're in a private cloud environment, and depending on what kind of environment you're in with our SaaS, your license gives you only one application instance. Okay, so you can only have one application server, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. The other topology is instead of load balancing, if performance is the main concern and not availability, but it's more about performance, you can have 2 application servers without a load balancer. And what that does is allows you to have your main users log into one URL. So for example, your company name.acumatica.com. All your users come in here, they get serviced by this application server. Then you have a separate processing node, this is the Acumatica application instance. And this one could be for your integrations and long-running processes. So maybe you have a Magento website and the system needs to always synchronize data between Magento and Acumatica in the background. Or maybe you're pushing data out through EDI at a very high volume. Or maybe you're printing pick tickets or creating shipments on a schedule automatically in the background every half an hour. And what you want to do is that allows you to offload that work from your primary server to this second server, and it allows your users to get optimal experience always on this main server here. And integrations and long-running processes run on a separate processing node. So the way you do this is you request a additional processing node, and Acumatica can license you additional processing node. They do cost money, but they are significant small fraction of your overall license pricing. So if you're into very large volume and have very high number of integrations, talk to your partner a little bit about processing nodes, and we can certainly spend some time with you to come up with the best topology for your environment. The point here is Acumatica is very flexible. It can be deployed in many, many different configurations. So hopefully this information was helpful to you. You can learn a lot more about Acumatica's licensing, pricing, um, the SaaS FAQs, how our backup processes work, how do we use geozones, can you get backup access to your backup data, all these types of questions you're going to probably find at the Acumatica SaaS FAQs. And if you have questions about our maintenance and SLA, this is a link that can be quite helpful to you. Okay, looks like we've categorized the questions here, so I'm going to go ahead and move to the questions slide and let's try to catch the common ones. Okay, there's a question here on geolocations and failover included with standard subscription, or is it as an additional cost? The answer is we automatically put your data in multiple locations and we back up that data as part of our SaaS offering. So as long as you're on the Acumatica SaaS, that's included. There's no additional cost for that. You don't have to worry about failover because that's covered under your SLA. So if there's any downtime, we're responsible to make sure your system is back up and operational. We, based on our SLAs, we can only be down about 3.3 hours a month, and that includes our maintenance window, and that's usually happens only in the middle of the night, as I mentioned. So, and our record has been, 99.9999, which is less than typically 5 minutes downtime per month on average. So we have a pretty good track record here on our SaaS. But if you go on your private cloud options, then that's up to you to implement. Do you want your data backed up in multiple zones? And what does it take to do that? You have to consult with your partner and IT professionals to figure those pieces out. Okay. All right. Next question here. What happens when you import and export using import scenarios with large number of records? Do those count as transactions like ERP transactions? So as an example, if I'm importing 1,000 invoices, does that count as 1,000 ERP transactions and commercial transactions? The answer is yes, import and exports do count, but we understand that during the implementation phase, so in your initial 3-4 months that you first get the license, we don't look at your transaction counts because you're not live yet. You're importing, so don't worry about importing historical data. If you're importing historical data, you let your partner know, your partner lets us know, and we clear off any warnings that come up on your license. We can clear them off because we know these are not prevalent and they're just initial processes. And then once you get going, then yeah, if you have a third-party website that you haven't integrated in and you're manually importing those orders in every day through import scenarios, then yes, they would count as transactions. Okay. I see a question similar about development and customizations and how that can drive up ERP transaction volumes. It's a very good question. So we have something we call non-production licenses. So my suggestion is, and most developers like to work locally with their machines anyway. They don't like to impact your main server or sandboxes. So typically you're going to be in a sandbox or in a local environment when you're developing or customizing or you're thinking about upgrading and you're testing. So these are what we call non-production environments. So non-production environments usage does not go against your ERP and commercial transaction volumes. The only thing we count is production usage. And again, during your implementation phase, those things, all bets are off because we know that you're just testing and you're getting prepared. So we won't count those initial few months towards your counts as well. Okay. There was a question about can you generate a report on details of your commercial transactions for each month? The answer is there's no report, but there's a statistics tab that I showed you guys. You can go to the license monitoring, go to statistics tab. That does have an export button, so you can export to Excel. So if you need to create a graph of it or you need to show it to somebody, make sure you use that export button for Excel, and you can take those volumes out. Now, the license monitoring console is only available in version 2018 and beyond. So one of the questions in here is, I'm an older customer. How do I see my volumes? That's a great question. So if you're on the older licensing model pre-April 2018, that licensing monitoring console is not going to show you any data. So if you're on version 2017 or 6.1, those older versions don't have that screen and they don't capture any statistics. Your partner, however, can give you a tool. So there is a tool available to our partners. They can install that tool in your environment, and that tool will go back and pull historical data to give you an idea of your transaction volume. We don't force any old customers into the new models. If you're happy with CPU licensing that you were on, you're welcome to stay there. But we believe that most customers will benefit by the newer model, the post 2018, April 2018 model. So if you're not sure, there's no harm in asking. We can always create a call and discuss your differences. And if it makes sense for you to move to consumption model based on transaction tiers, because it'll give you typically better experience and better performance. If it makes sense, we do that. If not, and you want to stay on the old model, that's fine as well. Okay. All right. There's a question here on snapshots and how they affect volumes. It's a good question. So a snapshot is exactly that. It's a snapshot. So if you restore a snapshot, you're also restoring the state as it was at the time of snapshot. So if I take a snapshot today, I go on working for 3 days, and then I restore a snapshot, I'm back to what I was 3 days ago. So all my statistics, everything goes back in time to that snapshot. And snapshots don't take any, they take one ERP transaction. They don't inflate. So don't worry about, oh, if I take a snapshot, it's going to count as a bunch of ERP transactions or a bunch of commercial transactions. The answer is no. Snapshots don't take any large volume of transactions. They typically will count as one ERP transaction, the entire snapshot. Okay. Okay, does running an MRP, which is when they say MRP, they mean, I presume this is related to manufacturing. Does it count as an ERP transaction? Creating an MRP depends on what you do with that. One of the purposes of that is to figure out, what materials you need. So the actual creation of the purchase orders will count. The MRP itself will sound, because you're saving the plan, that would be an ERP transaction. If you create any production orders count as ERP transactions, but only purchase orders. Things that you deal with a customer or vendor are commercial transactions. So anything you do internally, such as manufacturing process internally, those are just ERP transactions. Okay. Another good question is, can I see what the source of my ERP transactions are? Unfortunately, the licensing monitoring console does not show you the source of ERP transactions. You can only see the source of the commercial transactions. That work is under progress. Hopefully sometimes this year, maybe 20 or 2, we will introduce that for you. But if you're over the limits or close to the limits, You can ask us, hey, what is this about? We can do some analysis on our end and provide your partner with the information so that they can go back and look. So if you're already you're close to your ERP limits, or you're over for some reason and you don't know why, and you're scratching your head, just contact us and your partner, and we can find out for you on our side. Okay. All right. I think that answered all the questions. I hope this was helpful to everyone. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.